All right, welcome back. So we are going to be talking about the third part of the sequence of engagement, which is reason. At this point, we have worked with our students to help regulate them. We have built connections with them to build that relationship. Now we're ready to access the learning brain and to start learning. So at this point, when we've reached this part of the brain, the upper neocortex, this is time to teach. This is our time to shine. But I want to be clear that just because students have reached this upper level of their brain and are ready for these more complex cognitive functions, doesn't mean that we can completely forsake the idea of keeping them regulated and related. So while we're teaching, it's also our responsibility to observe our students and check in with them frequently to see how they're doing. If we notice symptoms of disengagement, maybe students are spacing out or being restless, that's our cue as teachers to take a break and then come back with more regulation activities, relating activities, and then building back up to a place where students are ready to learn again. Obviously, it can be really frustrating when students are disengaged, and I think a lot of teachers, especially young or new teachers, have a tendency to be demoralized by that. And so I want to remind you that don't take this disengagement personally. Students are not disengaging with the content or the class because they have a vendetta against you. And oftentimes, individuals are aware of the fact that they are disengaged, and it's a distressing experience for them. Them not wanting to be disengaged, them wanting to be part of the group and part of the activities. So be gentle, and keep in mind that it is okay to go back to that first step of regulation. Once we're ready to learn, we don't stay ready to learn all of the time. All right, so to wrap up, in summary, so we know that the brain processes information vertically from bottom to top, with information ascending through the brainstem, up through the diencephalon, through the limbic system, and finally ending in the neocortex. These levels of the brain correspond respectively to increasingly complex cognitive processes. So when someone is quote unquote trapped in the brainstem or diencephalon, they're not really capable of having those really deep critical thoughts and discussions at that point. So in order for us to engage individuals at that highest cognitive level, that reasoning, we have to first regulate them by calming that fight, flight, or freeze response, and then work on relationship building, creating warmth. And that's connecting with others through an attuned and sensitive relationship. All right, so now that we've talked about the neurosequential sequence, that sequence of engagement, I want to give you some practical ideas for bringing that into the classroom. And we're going to talk about the creation of resiliency routines. So as educators, as leaders within our organizations, it's our responsibility to create a safe, welcoming, trauma-informed environment. And the purpose of this is threefold. First, we want to limit re-traumatization. We don't want our organizations or our classrooms to be sites of harm. We also create trauma-informed spaces to support effective cognitive resource allocation. I said it earlier, but we know that scared brains can't learn. So if we can create a safe environment, that allows our students to take all of that energy and all of that focus and apply it to the tasks at hand. And the third thing is a trauma-informed environment promotes healthy emotional regulation. Not only is healthy emotional regulation important for being part of a learning community, for functioning in the classroom, it's also part of functioning in society and interpersonal relationships. So anything that we can do to teach students these skills and encourage them to practice them will only serve them well in the other areas of their life. The bottom line is that a trauma-informed pedagogy acknowledges the adversity in our students' lives and provides strategies to respond compassionately. So not only do we see our students, but we are actively and always devising ways to reach out to them and respond to them. I want to highlight this quote. This says, individuals who have experienced trauma have difficulty functioning unless they feel safe and supported. The more that we do to help students and faculty and staff regulate their emotions, build healthy relationships, and focus on the task at hand, the better performance we will see from each individual. So not only do these trauma-informed practices create healthy environments that prepare students for real-world situations, it also affects our bottom line. Trauma-informed environments often have better academic outcomes as well too, and that's a thing to keep in mind. All right, we're going to talk about implementing this information into the classroom, specifically along the lines of the 4 S's. So the first S of implementation is managing the situation. I often find that this is the easiest of the 4 S's and therefore the best place to start. So when it comes to controlling your situation, that means minimizing stressors and triggers, and that allows students to temporarily remove themselves from adverse experiences and circumstances and focus on learning and logic. And the purpose of managing the situation by minimizing stressors and triggers, that protects survivors from further harm and re-traumatization. We can also further do that by incorporating content warnings. And when I talk about content warnings or trigger warnings, those are simply a heads up to your students that you will be discussing difficult subject matter at some point in the class. The way that I incorporate content warnings into my teaching is I use a lot of outside media to illustrate things to my students. Music videos, clips from movies, outside texts. And sometimes these outside texts or videos or images can contain depictions or situations that are re-triggering for the students. So for example, one of the core texts that we use, there is a brief reading passage that alludes to domestic violence. That passage could be very re-traumatizing and very triggering for someone who is a victim or survivor of domestic violence. And so I try to choose content for my classroom that avoids common triggers such as domestic violence, sexual assault. Within our community, war trauma is very common. But when it's unavoidable, I let the students know as soon as possible that these subjects are coming up. And then I give them a couple of options for how they want to choose to engage with that. If they feel that they won't be able to handle that situation, I give them the option to skip class with an additional makeup assignment. In my classroom, students always have the option to get up and take their own break and leave for a little bit. So I try to give students choice about how they want to handle this. And I never create a situation where students feel obligated to sit through traumatizing material simply to be successful academically. Part of managing the situation in a classroom is also maintaining a predictable environment and routine with clear expectations and standards. I find a lot of teachers have a really clear idea of what the schedule is in their classroom and what the rules and expectations are, but when I press them, it turns that they haven't really communicated those with the class. And so if you have these expectations for your students, but you don't communicate those to them, how can they meet them? How can they strive to meet those goals? So one of the ways that I like to keep that predictable environment and be transparent with my students is I share the rules at the top of every class. So if I'm teaching virtually, one of the first slides I show will be the rules. In my physical teaching space, I have my teaching rules posted on the wall in a pretty prominent place. And I like to keep my rules pretty simple. I think too many rules creates a punitive environment, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. So my basic rules for any learning environment that I am in charge of are mutual respect. And for me, mutual respect means respecting people's boundaries, both physical and emotional, honoring individuals' preferred name and pronouns. And this rule in particular is not negotiable or up for debate. If we're going to have any sort of learning community, there has to be a sense of respect and safety. My second rule, and this is especially important for me leading a lot of writing workshops, is active listening. So I'm reminding my students that when others are sharing their work or their ideas or their knowledge, you need to pay attention. Don't just sit there and wait for your turn to talk. I also have a caveat that I don't expect my students to sit totally still and make eye contact while listening. There are many, many different ways for people to listen. So some of my students doodle, some knit. I'm personally just a fidgeter. But you can tell when your students are engaging their bodies in order to listen versus engaging their bodies in order to disengage. So allowing your students some creativity and freedom with how they want to listen. And my third rule is compassion. This kind of seems like a basic thing, but I think it's a really important reminder for people, because oftentimes when we have bad days, we can forget to be compassionate towards others and ourselves. So I remind my students to be compassionate, that this is a new experience for many of us, to be patient. Sharing writing is scary and vulnerable, so be kind. And a reminder that people have anxiety, so we have to be understanding. And on top of that, I also model the appropriate behaviors. Remain calm, quiet, and present when possible. I have a pretty hard and fast rule in my learning environments across my whole life. I will not ask individuals to do something for me that I am not willing or able to do myself. So if you have expectations for behavior, you need to model that behavior for your students. The second S of implementation is self, and that applies both to ourselves as teachers and the selves of our students. I really want to focus on how we encourage students to advocate and care for themselves, which increases feelings of confidence. One of the core experiences of trauma we talked about was disempowerment, and through encouraging students to advocate for themselves, we can re-empower them and actually make them less susceptible to re-traumatization. And a little bit of the theory behind that is we know that individuals with a strong belief in their own abilities to succeed have what we call high self-efficacy. And that means they have a tendency to focus on possibilities rather than limits and inadequacies. So self-efficacious individuals are often more optimistic. We also know that people with high levels of self-efficacy are more resilient. And resilience is really the key to avoiding re-traumatization. And that's why so much of our work now is focusing on creating resiliency routines, creating opportunities for students to learn how to be resilient and practice it in a safe environment. One of the ways that we create an empowering environment where I work is we look at the gradual release of responsibility framework. This is very similar to teach, model, practice, apply, or I do it, we do it, and you do it. So not expecting the student to take full responsibility for their knowledge at first, but slowly handing it off to them and modeling what that process looks like to them. All right, so the third S of implementation is support. And this is probably one of the most important. A lot of our students, when they come to us, they need so much more than just academic support. And when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, before we can even start to work on self-actualization and esteem goals, we have to make sure that our students' physiological safety and love and belonging needs are met. And that's really important for us, especially as directors of a program, those of us in outreach. We should be locating and connecting with community resources before a crisis. So I recommend, in addition to emergency numbers, save or memorize the contact information for local mobile crisis team, which is a safer alternative to police intervention during a mental health emergency. And also knowing where students can turn to help meeting basic needs. So having an action plan. If a student confides in you that their household is going hungry or they are precariously unhoused, what can you do to address that? Where can you send them? Who can help them? So having a plan for this before it comes into play is really important. The fourth and final S of implementation is strategy. Not just talking about what our strategies as teachers are, but thinking about our students' strategies. We talked a little bit about behaviors and how behaviors are only problematic when they clash with expectations. Oftentimes, individuals will develop behaviors, protective behaviors, and these behaviors kept them alive, kept them healthy, kept them surviving at one point in their life. And so even though these behaviors might seem out of place in the classroom, it's important for us to understand that these behaviors had a role and a time and a place in keeping our students well and alive long enough for us to work with them. Behaviors and attitudes are often a protective response to perceived danger. Like I said, many trauma survivors learned these strategies as a way to survive. So instead of trying to extinguish these threatening situations, which is often far above our pay grade, working on providing alternatives to extreme responses. For students that are hyper-aroused and expressing that they have a lot of energy or anxiety, I recommend providing opportunities for physical engagement. So if you have activities where you can get the students up and moving while still teaching, while still learning, great. Allow breaks, so allow students to take breaks at their own discretion, if that's an option for you. Allow gentle, non-disruptive movements. Some students are able to rock and keep themselves engaged back and forth, or offer alternative seating, such as yoga, exercise balls. And personally, I have a couple of different chairs in my office, just depending on what kind of state I am for the day. Right now, I'm sitting in a pretty big, comfy, easy chair behind my desk. But for the days that I'm feeling a little bit hyper-aroused and anxious, I will move myself to a wheeled office chair so I can kind of get the wiggles out and keep myself focused on the task at hand. All right, so let's take a look at these 4 S's and see how they can be implemented in the classroom to create a resiliency routine. And my goal is just to share with you some of the resiliency routines that I use and that my staff use. And I hope that you can see things that you like and implement them in your own classroom and adapt them for your own students. So before class even starts, a prepared teacher is a good teacher. A prepared teacher is a ready teacher. So before class starts, walk around your classroom and take inventory of the physical environment. Minimize any unusual or intrusive sensory experiences in your classroom. So if you have a creaky fan, that could be disruptive to students. Go ahead and give maintenance a call and see if they can fix it. If there are things in your room, smells, sounds, whatever, that you can't address or you can't fix, make sure you identify those to students. A great example of this is in a former classroom. One of our air conditioning vents sounded an awful lot like an air raid siren. And because a number of my students have traumatic experience that have to do with warfare, including air raids, I made sure that the first day of class, I pointed the sound out to them and let them know exactly what it was and let them know that it wasn't a threat. You can also ensure classrooms, exits, restrooms, and other facilities are clearly identified in a way or language students can understand. So especially if you are working with students with disabilities or students with low or emergent literacy, just because our classrooms are clearly labeled for us doesn't mean that they can use those language cues to navigate. And if you've ever been lost in an unfamiliar area, it's a really frightening experience. So making sure that you have signage that allows your students to kind of orient and navigate independently. Also, encourage students to arrive early to give themselves time to get situated, to get settled, to kind of start that regulating process. This also helps limit disruptions for other students who have gotten to class on time already. And it's really, really important to greet every individual that walks into your space warmly, enthusiastically, and using their name if you know it. And not just using their name, but making sure that you are using their preferred name pronounced correctly. At the beginning of class, start off by greeting the class warmly and enthusiastically, either as a whole or individually. Be sure to take time to introduce yourself, even if it's the 30th time or the 300th time you've appeared in front of this class. Just make sure you acknowledge your name and that you are the teacher. And if you have any visitors, any new students, any staff, any observers, even maintenance people, make sure you introduce them to the class and let them know the purpose for them being there. Take the time to get those names correct, including spelling and pronunciation. If you can do that the first time, great. If it takes you a couple of tries to get those names right, that's fine too, as long as you're making an earnest effort. And to keep in mind that regulate, relate, and reason sequence. So don't just jump right into reviewing last week's lessons or teaching something new, but start the class with a grounding exercise or meditation to hit that regulation step, and following it by a check-in to build relationships. During class, continue to observe students' levels of engagement. If you see that they are disengaged, respond to those changes correctly by doing a regulating and relating activity to re-engage them. And as you're checking in with students, don't forget to check in with yourself. Ask yourself, how am I feeling? And ask, am I constantly modeling emotionally regulated behavior? Am I modeling the behavior I want my students to see? If you are teaching or you're in a classroom environment and you notice yourself getting upset and agitated, remove yourself for a couple of seconds to calm back down. Stepping out of the classroom for a few minutes to calm down is a much different, much more manageable situation than letting your frustration get to a level where you might lash out at a student and create more harm. Reminder to enforce standards of conduct and rules as needed. Not only does this tie into the idea of consistency, but safety as well too. And provide students with sincere and specific praise. Not just enough to tell them, hey, you did a good job, but let them know what they're doing well so they can continue to replicate that behavior and continue to be successful. At the end of class, before you send everybody out the door, make sure to engage the whole class in a reflective discussion and to create space for students to ask clarifying and follow-up questions. Many individuals are either hesitant or just not able to formulate questions in the moment and really benefit from taking a little bit of extra time at the end of class to let things sink in and process. Summarize the lesson, highlighting the most important parts. Even our most engaged and diligent students are bound to miss something over the course of the class. And remind students about homework, upcoming events, or other information relating to their next class. Forgetting about these kind of things is not a moral failure, and normalizing the need to ask for reminders or receive reminders is really, really helpful for students as well, too. So a couple of questions I'd like you to consider. What resiliency routines do you have in place in your classroom? Or what routines do you see yourself implementing? How could you do regulating work at your level? So if you work with low literacy learners, how can you help engage them in regulating work? How could you set up your classroom or school space to ground learners? Could you have a grounding or meditation station where students can go to regroup? How can you model resilience for your learners and for yourself? And again, asking, what are you able or willing to do differently? All right, so in summary, these resiliency routines, these routines that have been designed with the sequence of engagement in mind, resiliency routines limit re-traumatization, support effective cognitive resource allocation, and promote healthy emotional regulation. That means that resiliency routines create an environment where students are not going to be exposed to trauma again, where they can focus on the academic tasks at hand, and where they learn to engage with their emotions in a healthy way. And as we look at these resiliency routines, keeping in mind the 4 S's, controlling the situation, create a physically and psychologically safe learning environment. Teach them more about the self, teach students to advocate for themselves, build their confidence through specific and sincere praise. Be mindful of the types of support that learners need outside of academics. Locate and connect with those community resources before a crisis. And strategy. Understand why your students engage in the behaviors they're engaging in and look to provide alternatives for those behaviors. All right, so we are at the end of our session. So over the course of these 3 videos, we have talked about the definition of trauma, identified the effects, symptoms, and core experience of trauma exposure. We've defined safety in the context of trauma-informed practices as warmth and structure. We've discussed how to respond compassionately and effectively using the regulate, relate, reason, neurosequential heuristic. And we've developed and implemented resiliency routines. If you have questions or follow-up comments, or you would like more information about the topics covered here, feel free to reach out to me at cbert@gclearningcenter.org. I will also post a link to the participant folder in the video description, where you can access copies of the slideshow as well as articles, research bases, annotated bibliographies, really all the resources I've gathered over the course of this work. Thank you for joining me, thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day.